All right. Thank you, Bruce, for the great introduction, the thoughtful introductory comments. Thank you. Where's my friend Adam? Somewhere. There he is. For give you a little bit of context for organizing this, and thank you to Dr. McIntosh, obviously, for coming. The Evolutionary Studies program here at New Paltz started in 2007, and I think Adam may have been a psychology student at about that time. It was his first semester, and he will never forget it. And we started having, we've become pretty well known for having the, speakers related to evolution on lots of different topics. And at our receptions, Adam and some folks from his organization would sometimes come and represent a Christian view and bring pamphlets and this kind of thing. And it was always done in a cordial, respectful, and appropriate manner. And it was interesting because when I worked to start the Evolutionary Studies program with a bunch of other faculty at New Paltz, I hadn't anticipated, or I guess thought through the evolution, religious context and history. So Adam was really the first person that sort of had me think about that. He went on and graduated, and I was pleased when he contacted me a few months ago to invite me to do this. So that's my context. I love evolution. I think it's extraordinary. I think it is extremely powerful. I think that the capacity of evolutionary principles to help understand all of life itself is simply fantastic, and I guess that's the point that I'm pretty much going to be talking about today. From my perspective, evolution is a watershed framework. Watershed meaning something that changes the playing field, something that changes the parameters. To our ability to understand what it means to be human has been extraordinarily improved as a function of evolution. So I'll tell you a little bit about the organization of this talk. Four basic areas. I'm going to talk to you about evolutionary psychology. When I was first approached about this, Dr. McIntosh has a very impressive academic history and has had these conversations extensively with people. I'm a psychologist, research psychologist, so I do research on the foundations of human behavior, understanding basic psychological processes. I'm not a geologist, I'm not an evolutionary biologist. So it occurred to me that if we were going to have this discussion, and by the way, I did want it to be formally called a discussion, with the air quotes. The main thing I said is, well, I can talk about psychology. And one of the topics that Dr. McIntosh had was related to that he had put forward. And so I'll be talking about evolutionary psychology, which is great because not everyone knows what it is. So I get to talk to you about it. Evolutionary psychology sits within a very powerful intellectual framework. And I will talk to you about why that is and what I mean by that. And I will next talk to you about examples of evolutionary psychology related to important social issues. Early on in the history of the Evolutionary Studies program, my good friend Brian from sociology and some other folks on campus started some conversations about the social utility of evolutionary psychology. So this is something that, thanks to a lot of good dialogue on this fantastic, vibrant campus, has really gotten me to think about, well, what is the social utility of evolutionary psychology? So I'll be talking about that. Evolutionary studies is broad. It's interdisciplinary. It's not just a single area. It's a broad set of ideas across all of the academic areas. So I'll be talking also about evolution writ large related to humanity in general. So I'll tell you a little bit about how I think of evolution and evolutionary psychology. George Williams, renowned biologist who was at Stony Brook, passed away a few years ago, had a very general understanding or definition of evolution, which I think works really well, at least for my work and the work of my students in my lab. Evolution is nothing more than a statistical bias in the rate of perpetuation of alternatives. This essentially means that replicating entities, by definition, will out-exist non-replicating entities in the future. And this is actually broader than DNA, it's broader than life itself, it's broader than physiological adaptations. The basic idea here, and I see it as essentially a logical truism, is things that replicate will be more likely to exist in the future compared with things that don't replicate. This is a pretty straightforward idea, but it's very powerful. Evolutionary psychology is basically the idea that human behavior is part of the natural world. Sometimes there's a lot of definitions. There are different evolutionary psychologists with different versions. This is essentially the version that I espouse in my own work. It's an application of evolutionary principles to understanding human behavioral patterns, largely understanding human behavioral patterns as serving the adaptationist function of facilitating survival and reproductive success, because these are the mechanisms by which organisms make it into the future. Evolutionary psychology is powerful, and this is powerful science. I have published a good bit of articles on the topic of the utility of evolutionary psychology. In 2006, I published something called Evolutionary Psychology is Not Evil, and Here's Why. And I published that for a reason. This is a field that comes under scrutiny, and I've known about this for a long time. I've thought about it for quite a while. The most powerful response to the scientific criticisms I've seen of evolutionary psych are found in an article published by Ketelaar and Ellis in 2000, where they talk about two basic dimensions of what makes a good science, what's a good scientific field. They talk about progressivity and the ability to digest anomalies, and these sound like very complex academic words, but I'll explain what they are. Progressivity from this framework means something that has the capacity to generate new questions. Because if you have a new scientific framework, or a scientific framework that leads to the creation of new questions, that enables you to come up with new answers, which means you can learn more information. So if you have some set of ideas that leads to questions that were never asked before, that leads to knowledge that had never been obtained before, then you got something very useful on your hands that should probably be expanded within higher education. The ability to digest anomalies, I love that phrase. It's the ability to help us understand phenomena, things that happen, that prior frameworks were not able to explain. So if there's something about anything, in my field, something about human behavior that people are just like, why does that happen? It doesn't make much sense. If you have a new framework that comes in and says, well, here's why it happens, and we can do empirical research demonstrating that, then that's a useful scientific framework. I live and breathe this stuff. I've taught evolutionary psychology courses since 1998 in various forms, so I probably think too much about this, and for that I'm not going to apologize, but I will tell you that it's true. So I have a lot of examples. When I was thinking about what's a good example where I can tell this to an audience that's unfamiliar with my work, that's maybe a little bit skeptical about where I'm coming from, the Garcia effect, I think, is really just a very solid example that I'll present to you. This came about in the 1950s. John Garcia was an experimental psychologist back in the day. The prevailing framework in research psychology for a long time was something that we call behaviorism. Behaviorism is a powerful idea. Honestly, I think it's a very strong scientific framework unto itself. But like any set of ideas, it was, to some extent, I think, pushed a little bit too much by certain folks, and people were having a hard time, scientists were having a hard time seeing the liabilities of this framework. Some of the basic ideas of behaviorism, which essentially says that an organism's environment across its development are exclusively responsible for what it does. One of the points is this idea that all stimuli should have the same effect. So if there's different kinds of punishing stimuli, they should all have the same effect on behavior as one another. Stimuli paired more closely in time to one another should have a more powerful effect on behavior. Another basic idea of behaviorism is learning is incremental. Many trials are needed. If you have a behavior and it's followed by a consequence, that needs to happen lots of times for learning to occur. Another basic premise of behaviorism was that evolutionary history of the species is unimportant, that it doesn't matter what evolution has to say about where this animal come from, where the species came from. Well, Garcia did a bunch of research that was at the time so controversial that he had academic societies questioning him to see his original data, and he had labs throughout the nation saying, we don't believe what you're saying. And I'll tell you what it was that was so controversial that he found that ended up being replicated in lab after lab to the point that we now have an effect named after him, the Garcia effect, which is in pretty much every introductory psychology textbook I've ever seen. Simple study. He had rats, because in the old days, that's what you studied. Again, because species differences from this perspective didn't matter. Rats were presented with a sugary water solution They either were presented with that watery solution, with sugary solution, with an immediate shock, or a blast of radiation that had delayed adverse consequences. So either it was hurt a lot now, or it was given something that didn't have an adverse consequence until hours later. Very straightforward findings. Rats in the immediate shock condition did not learn to avoid the food. They came back the next day. They licked the food. They got shocked. They came back the next day. They licked the food. They got shocked. They never learned to not drink that water. On the other hand, rats in the radiation with delayed effects condition learned to avoid the food on a single trial. And the adverse consequence, which was nausea, which was physiological digestive sickness, did not come about until 5 hours after the presentation of the stimulus. This was shocking. I guess that's no pun intended. This was shocking to the field of behaviorists. Behaviorists didn't like this. They said, that can't be true. That doesn't make sense. That's not within how we understand behavior. He took an evolutionary perspective. This was the real rudimentary time of taking Darwin's ideas of selection and applying them to behavior. And this was one of the, I think, early success stories in that area. Under ancestral conditions, aversive consequences were more likely to be like the radiation with delayed effects condition. Under the ancestral condition of rats, if they ate something, what kind of aversive consequence would they get if there was something bad about the food? Would they get shocked immediately, or would they throw up 5 hours later? Has anyone here ever eaten something, you've gotten sick, and hours later, and you're like, I'm not going to ever eat that again? Raise your hand if you've ever had that experience. You have had the Garcia effect happen to you. This finding only makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. It does not make sense without the understanding of evolution and the importance of the ancestral history of the species. It simply doesn't make sense. I am up to the third part of my talk. Examples of novel findings related to psychology. I am very fortunate in my career for a lot of reasons, but primarily because I oversee the Evolutionary Psych Lab here at SUNY New Paltz, which has, I'm going to say, I think, the best students on campus, or at least some of the best students on campus. Recently, I think this was maybe a year or two ago, this was the entire team of the Evolutionary Psych Lab. We put together a paper for Evo's journal, which was really designed to just give examples of how the evolutionary perspective has shed light, or has capacity to shed light, on different areas of psychology. So we call it evolution integrated across all islands of the human behavioral archipelago. All psychology is evolutionary psychology. And if you want, you can access this from my website, free download. And it really is, I think we did a great job, but it really is designed to show, wow, evolution has helped us understand developmental psychology, clinical psychology, social psychology, with brand new findings that we never would have had without applying an evolutionary lens. So I do want to thank there's a picture of us. This is about a year or two outdated, but look how awesome our lab is, and we are always that happy, I will tell you. So I'm very fortunate to be working with these kids. So this is the basic framework of that article, which I'd say is sort of the meat of this presentation. There's lots of areas in psychology. When I talk to students in introductory psychology, what is psychology? It's anything that has to do with human thought or human behavior. It's huge, it's enormous, it's broad. Education, there's educational psychology, there's political psychology. These are particular examples of psychology understood from an evolutionary, or studied from an evolutionary perspective, that have shed light on important social issues. Because again, the more I progress in my career, the more important I see that particular issue. So Peter Gray at Boston College has written extensively and studied extensively evolution applied to education. How you had education most likely is evolutionarily unnatural. Not saying it's bad, but I'm saying that if you look at what education looks like in our society, you probably had one grown-up who was about 30 or 40 years old all day, every day, with a group of you, about 20 or 30 of you, and you were all 10-year-olds or 11-year-olds or 8-year-olds, That's what education looks like in the United States. Peter Gray said, that's weird from an evolutionary perspective, because he started studying pre-Westernized societies. What does education look like in places that have not yet been essentially Westernized? And what he found was there are no examples of homogeneous age learning in such educational contexts. When you look at what things are like in non-Westernized societies, which is probably a decent window into what things were like before agriculture and civilization, education doesn't happen with a 40-year-old person teaching a bunch of 8-year-olds at the same time. Evolution happens in mixed age context. The most common teacher of an 8-year-old is a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old. These calls this evolutionary or educational scaffolding. There is no distinction between work, play, and school. These are distinctions that we throw onto these topics here. And there's lots of examples, such as the Sudbury School, where they have taken this idea and run with it and looked at mixed age learning, and they end up producing lots of great educational outcomes. Politics. Paul Bingham and Joanne Souza, who we were fortunate to host here a few times in the last couple of years, they published a brand new book, Death from a Distance, which talks about the origins of politics in humans. And it's just totally takes an evolutionary perspective and just rearranges how we understand human origins. Paul Bingham, who, in addition to getting a PhD in biology from Harvard, played Division I baseball as a pitcher, and he was very intrigued at the ability of humans to throw fast and accurately. In their presentation, he always gives a video of chimpanzees trying to throw a rock at a cheetah. There's about 6 or 7 of them. They are physically strong. They are 2 feet away, and they cannot hit the cheetah. They are pathetic at it. No offense to chimpanzees. They are not good at it. Human beings, at some point in our evolutionary history, evolved a remarkable ability to throw rocks accurately. Sounds like a weird thing to sit at the core of what it means to be human. But here's one thing from an evolutionary perspective that I guess gives pause to that. The ability to throw rocks accurately allowed our ancestors to exert a cost, a physical cost on a conspecific, another human, or on an animal during hunting or some other context with minimal cost to themselves. And that opened the door for creating groups that extended beyond kin lines, because if you had a whole group of individuals and you all had a rock, that totally changed the dynamics of whether a leader could exert unfair influence on a group. It totally changed the ability of individual groups to sort of fight with other groups for political purposes and territory and things like that. And they've demonstrated with lots of biological and anthropological and historical evidence that the ability, that projectile weapons abilities played a major role in the creation of political systems such as democracy and the expansion of human in-groups. Inner city blight, David Sloan Wilson at Binghamton, who is the person who started the Evolutionary Studies program years ago, recently published The Neighborhood Project, where he took a look at pro-social behavior in teens in Binghamton. Binghamton was recently rated as the most oppressed city in the United States, so there are some inner city problems in Binghamton. What he found was that beyond the effects of socioeconomic status, there were lots of things that really predicted whether kids were functioning well in terms of social and educational outcomes. And he studied the city as a biologist, as an evolutionary biologist, would study any organism within its natural environment, and ended up finding major predictors of what leads to success versus failure in social context for these kids. The evolutionary perspective was integral in allowing him to do that. Volkan Atkinson studied family. Under ancestral conditions, a very high proportion of offspring did not make it to age 1, did not make it to age 18. Human beings are extremely altricial, need an extraordinary amount of care, particularly early in life, but compared to other primates, our young need care for years and years. Then the evolutionary perspective gives us an extraordinary amount of information as to why this is the case. How much do we care about our children? Any parents in the room know more than you can imagine. And that is an important part of our evolutionary heritage. So understanding evolution helps us understand the core of the nature of family. Altruism. Why do people help each other? This is another area that's been elucidated extraordinarily by the evolutionary perspective. Killian Garvey has done some really cool, what they call trolley problem research. So there's a trolley going down the track. If you hit a switch, it's going to go down this track, and if you don't, it's going to go down this other track. You have two siblings on track A. There's four strangers on track B. Based on kin selection theory, which is a basic evolutionary idea that we over-benefit individuals with strong relatedness to one another, we save our siblings at the cost of twice as many strangers. And it takes lots and lots of strangers to put on that other track before we are willing to take out our siblings. So you think about all your sibling relationships in any context, and it turns out that siblings get along deep down better than you might think. Again, the evolutionary perspective is what has allowed us to understand that better. We can understand war a lot better. Do we care about understanding war? Is this something that we'd like to address, would like to better understand? David Livingstone Smith has developed a theory of war from an evolutionary perspective. One thing, and he's looked at warfare and representations of war in lots of contexts. Consistently, wars always exist. The only other species to ever show anything that looks like warfare is chimpanzees, and they do it in a mild scale compared to humans. It's usually all male coalitions that start war and that maintain war. And there is an extraordinary tendency to dehumanize the enemy in evolutionarily relevant kinds of ways. So during war, people tend to dehumanize the enemy by putting them as predators. They're an evil cobra, they're an evil eagle, something that's going to come down and kill us, so we got to kill them first, or prey. There's examples in the war literature of people seeing the enemy as bunnies, and we're going to go out rabbit hunting. This kind of thing, or vectors of disease, seeing your enemy as a louse or a rodent or something like a tick or an insect. We understand war better from an evolutionary perspective, and you should read The Most Dangerous Animal by David Livingstone Smith to get a good sense of that. We understand love better. Helen Fisher, who wrote The Anatomy of Love, has documented through lots of converging evidence, all based on an evolutionary framework, that the nature of love seems to have a very important physiological, hormonal, and evolutionary basis. Again, going back to the nature of humans as altricial, our young are not very capable early on. Deer can walk the first day or two of life. This is true of lots of other mammals. It is not true of humans. Love seems to be an evolved mechanism that facilitates monogamy or the connections between individuals to facilitate parenting for more than a single individual. We understand clinical psychology better, so the ultimate applications of psychology. How can we make people who are anxious, who are depressed, who are having psychological problems, how can we help these people? There's a bunch of research showing that the nature of phobias, which is a core part of what's addressed in clinical psychology, the nature of phobias is obviously evolutionarily relevant. We're much more likely to be phobic to spiders, snakes, and heights than we are to things like automobiles, guns, and electrical outlets, even though the latter are much more likely in this day and age to actually kill you. Under ancestral conditions, snakes were actually very likely to kill people, and in pre-Westernized societies to this day, over 5% of people's cause of death is from snake bite. So the tendency for humans to evolve a tendency to be afraid of snakes, for that to be a major kind of phobia, makes a lot of sense from an evolutionary perspective. The evolutionary perspective helps us better understand that. We can understand the nature of religion better. Religion is a very basic part of who we are, and basic religions such as Christianity have led to lots of extraordinary accomplishments for the nature of humans. The evolutionary perspective helps us understand the nature of religion. Religion is something that is human universal. It seems to have very common themes, regardless of the differences of content across different religions. Religions tend to have rules about facilitating helping of each other, facilitating sacrifice of the self at the cost to the group or for the benefit of the group. The traditional interface between evolution and religion has been one of conflict, but I guess the main thing I'd like to say, particularly if you don't know me and you're new here and you kind of came out for this event, it doesn't have to be like that. Instead of evolutionary scholarship as a tool to argue against religion, and I will say there have been people who've taken that approach, evolutionary scholarship can be used to really help us understand the nature of religion. These are examples of evolution applied to humanity more broadly. We understand human health a lot better because of the evolutionary perspective. One example is the paleo diet, that if you look at what things were like under ancestral conditions when human beings were primarily evolving before agriculture, we didn't have things like McDonald's. We didn't have the ability to easily acquire high-fat food and high-sugary foods. What we did have was a lot of drought and famine, and very common for people to die of starvation under ancestral conditions. And if you're likely to die of starvation, then evolving a tendency or a preference for high-fat foods is likely to lead you to those kinds of foods and get you through the next drought or the next famine. That's something that evolved under ancestral conditions. After agriculture, we haven't evolved out that particular tendency. And this is one of the reasons that when you see what we call diseases of westernized society, you see things like obesity, increased cardiovascular disease, increased type 2 diabetes. These are a consequence of a mismatch between how readily available these kinds of foods are now compared to our evolved tendencies or our evolved history when these foods were very rare and getting them a little bit would have been adaptive. The evolutionary perspective has helped us understand art better. Why do people do art? There's 5 major schools at the College of SUNY New Paltz. One of them is fine and performing arts. An entire 20% of the curriculum, roughly, dedicated to something that is obviously not survival-based. Why do we write poetry? Why do we paint? Why do we make sculptures? The evolutionary perspective, there's several books that have come out from the evolutionary perspective, and Alice Andrews' The Evolutionary Review, which is dedicated to helping us understand this particular topic. We can understand art an awful lot better because of the evolutionary perspective. The evolutionary perspective encourages us to ask why. We can understand crime a lot better. When Daly and Wilson studied within family homicide several years ago, they were the first people to ever look at the effect of step-parenting and how does step-parenting affect homicide in familial context. What they found was that the effect was extraordinary and that the likelihood of filicide from a step-parent was 100 times more than the likelihood of filicide from a biological parent. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes a lot of sense. This was 1990. They examined extensive data from large North American cities. No one had ever studied that before, or really understood that phenomenon before, until they applied the evolutionary framework. It's as if they had the evolutionary framework and got a giant spotlight out and said, oh, now we understand this pattern. Now we understand why this happens. We understand pregnancy a lot better, another basic aspect of humanity. It used to be that if a woman had morning sickness or pregnancy sickness, it used to be the case that doctors would say, well, let's come up with some kind of medicine to help treat that. Margie Prophet, a graduate student at the time at UCSB years ago, said, wait a minute, isn't this a human universal? Isn't there something natural about pregnancy sickness? Studied this from an evolutionary perspective, found that all the details of pregnancy sickness fall into line with the idea that this is actually an adaptation to help women who are pregnant reduce toxins or potential toxins from their body at a time when the fetus is developing the major organs. That's the kind of thing we understand better because of the evolutionary perspective. This is just the tip of the iceberg. I guess just in closing, to not incorporate the evolutionary perspective and understanding of what it means to be human, from my perspective, is a disservice. Evolutionary approaches have shown their utility in helping understand so much of who we are. So if we want to better understand things like education, war, and health, then I guess it's my bottom line, we omit the evolutionary perspective at a cost to understanding and improving human services. I would just like to close by thanking Adam Gordon for organizing this, Brianna Tauber, who put tons into this, Leo, where's our friend Leo? In that vicinity right there. The Undergraduate Psychology Association, who's been integral in this, my EVOS colleagues and students, I do see Alex and Amy back there. John Tobin, who's a friend of mine who has been a great sounding board for some of these ideas, and our special guest from across the pond, Dr. Andy McIntosh, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, it gives me great pleasure to be here, and I do thank very much the organisers of this debate. Thank you to Dr. Bruce Millam for chairing this, and thank you to Dr. Glenn Geher for being my very speaking in a very gracious way as my opponent, and I'll seek to also be the same. This is a very important issue, and I hope that we do see the implications as to this matter concerning mind and intelligence. Richard Dawkins said this: it is absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that. I leave you to decide whether this debater tonight is ignorant, stupid, insane, or wicked, because I don't accept evolution. By evolution, I mean not adaptation. I mean the idea that molecules became men, protons became prime ministers and presidents. I don't mean adaptation. By creation, we accept there is variation, but there is no common descent. We are not descended from the same creature originally as apes. There is no connection directly between us. C.S. Lewis said this: you must show that a man is wrong before you start explaining why he is wrong. The modern method is to assume without discussion. I'm not saying Dr. Geher has done this, but many people do this. In fact, he hasn't. But the modern method often is to assume that without discussion that he is wrong, and then distract his attention from this by busily explaining how he became so silly. So you often hear discussions which don't take each one another seriously. That's basically what C.S. Lewis is saying there. Professor John Lennox, well-known mathematician from Oxford, has said, the issue between the atheist and the believer is not whether it makes sense to question ultimate fact. It is rather the question, what fact is ultimate? Now, Dr. Geher hasn't said he's an atheist, and I know that, but I think he leaves room very much for many people to go towards atheism. The atheist's ultimate fact is the universe. The theist's ultimate fact is God. That is the burning question: in which direction does science point? Matter before mind, or mind before matter? And clearly, I'm in the last category. Dr. Geher has actually written this in his book, or in his writings, Evolutionary Psychology is Not Evil, which you referred to earlier. And he rightly says that about 87% of the US citizens don't believe that evolutionary forces in general, and natural selection in particular, unaided by a supernatural deity, are responsible for human origins. And clearly, the position that he takes is seeking, no doubt using very fair means, seeking to educate people in a different direction. I maintain that the reason why a good proportion of the US citizens are that way is because many of them have thought it through and actually see that there is every reason rationally to say that evolution doesn't fit the bill. We're going to look at some basic science, then I'm going to look at rationality, then I'm going to look at morality. Some basic science first. I'm going to look a little bit at my own subject. I'm not going to dwell on it too long because I'm aware that most of you haven't got that sort of background, and I don't intend to blind everybody with a lot of thermodynamics. But the issue of information is very crucial, so we will spend a little time on that. Some of this work is in a paper that I've written some years ago, Information and Entropy, Top-Down or Bottom-Up Development in Living Systems. Basically, in that paper, I'm arguing that information has to come first. Mind before matter. Mind has organized matter. Not matter has produced mind. That's the whole thesis of that paper. And you can refer to it if you wish afterwards, or if you want a copy of it, I can send it to you. This is a very important issue. Little bit on thermodynamics. The proposal of many people, and I'm aware that Dr. Geher isn't in this area, and I'm not expecting him to immediately pick this up, but some of you will be. The proposal from many people who are in my area is that a lot of energy can build machinery. That all you need is a blasting of a lot of energy and it will produce incredible molecular machines, which of course are in our brains. which is what we're going to be thinking of to do with mind. Now, my position is that energy will do nothing unless there is a machine ready to use it usefully, already there. You will not produce machines by blasting random energy on a pile of molecules in a pea soup 4.5 billion years ago. You just will never do it. Despite what the people who oppose me say, photosynthesis is a supreme example of a machine already being there, ready to constrain the energy which is coming in and to use it usefully to produce sugars for the plant and oxygen, as well as taking in carbon dioxide. So that's a clear example of where you need a machine already there before you can make use of lots of energy coming in. Energy on its own does not raise the energy level for you doing useful work. So, to put it simply, such that I know most of you aren't from a thermo background, cars need engines. Whether it be this chap saying you've got a wind-up engine there, or whether it's something else like this. You can put all the petrol, or you would say gasoline, so I have to learn to speak your lingo. And you drive cars, you drive automobiles, I should say, on pavements, whereas we walk on pavements. Anyway, we'll work go down that way. You can put all the petrol, gasoline you want into the car, but with no engine, she isn't going anywhere, right? So the idea that if you've just got a lot of energy, this time in the gasoline, it's not going to do anything unless you've got an engine ready to use it. Theodor von Karman, an aerospace engineer, brilliantly said this on one occasion. Science studies what is there, but engineering brings into existence what was not there before. And that's very relevant. The mind of engineers brilliantly builds aeroplanes. The minds of engineers brilliantly builds machinery, right down today to the molecular level. But you need minds first, not matter first. So that idea that I mentioned earlier is wrong. Random energy doesn't build machines. So I come now to information, still under this heading of some basic science. You well know that DNA is full of a massive information system, which is conveying from the nucleotides coded information to the RNA and to the single-stranded RNA and to the ribosome, which will eventually build, using amino acids, the proteins that we need in our bodies. But probably people don't realize that to actually make that DNA string together and to produce to polymerize, basically, the DNA and to make those strands, you can't do it without there being another machine close by. Those who do chemistry know that you cannot make an endothermic reaction work unless you've got precisely the right system to actually put the energy in to make it work. So you have to go through what's called an energized intermediate. Those of us who do chemistry know that that is like what's called an activation energy. And so making DNA, you can't do it. The free energy change, if you're thinking of thermodynamics, you don't need to worry too much about the term, but you'll never do it. Just putting the raw building blocks into a Petri dish will never produce DNA. What you've got to do is go through energized building blocks, and the way that is done is by having ATP, which is a brilliant little motor, which itself is unstable and cannot arise by accident in a Petri dish as well, okay? It's a very unstable molecule. A jet, all this system is going on in every single living system. ATP is a brilliant compound. So how do we make DNA? Once you've got the energized building blocks, then that polymerizes the DNA. The sugar phosphate bonds then begin to join together because they've been energized into a triphosphate state and they relax back to a monophosphate state. So that is the way the information system in our cells works. And you well know that there are 4 letters, basically, cytosine, guanine, adenine, and thymine, which will in triplet form, then stand for amino acids, as is indicated here. So you've got CAT standing for a particular amino acid, CTT standing for yet another amino acid, and so on. And a string of amino acids makes proteins as the ribosome does that. And this is all going on as an information system in every single cell of living systems. So I now come to this issue as to where rationality comes from. Because we've got a mind and we've got intelligence. Are we really saying that matter produced intelligence? Or is it, as was said earlier by John Lennox, that mind came first? Let's just look at this matter. What I've been basically arguing for is that you haven't just got matter and energy. You've got an information system. And we need to understand that information is not defined by matter and energy. Let's have a look at this a bit more. You see, in the coded system in DNA, the code and the language of DNA language is not defined by the material. Well, we know that in our own experience as we use English. I'm using sound waves, but the sound waves don't define the English language. Neither does writing English on paper. The writing in the paper doesn't define the patterns. No, that is something which is transcendent to the paper and the matter or the spoken language. The message also isn't defined by the code and the language. That's the second point. I'm speaking English. If I'd been clever enough, and if you'd wanted it, I might have been able to speak the whole lecture in French or in Chinese. But the message, hopefully, if it had been translated, perhaps we had somebody here doing it, the message, you hope, would be the same. Message isn't defined by language, and language isn't defined by matter and energy. Have you got that? Have you understood this basic concept? Because this is vital to now understand information. Message is transcendent to matter and energy. Well, message is, first of all, transcendent to the language, because if there had been a different DNA code, we might have used a different language. But God, who made the DNA, has actually used the DNA language, but it could have been a different language. So information is not the same depending what language is used. Just to repeat these 2 points, information isn't defined, for instance, by a CD or a DVD. That's just a material on which the information is stored. It's an arrangement, it's a code. And in fact, it's down to a series of zeros and ones, as you well know, for computer language. Information isn't the same as matter and energy. If I saw that little series of dots and dashes, I wouldn't have a clue what it meant generally. Probably most of you don't have a clue what it meant. But if we translate that into a different language, we shall understand that John loved Mary. Because the first one was in Morse code. And probably Mary wasn't interested in lots of dots and dashes. So you get the point here that the whole point about the nucleotide bases, A, C, G, and T, is that they may be positioned essentially randomly, and if there were any affinities between them, their information-carrying potential would be drastically reduced. It's the very fact that there is no chemical affinity, there is no chemical reason why they should be in their triplet form, which gives it the capacity to carry information, which is non-material. Michael Polanyi put it brilliantly when he said, whatever may be the origin of a DNA configuration, it can function as a code only if its order is not due to the forces of potential energy. It must be as physically indeterminate as the sequence of words on a printed page. That's the point. You see, there is no chemical reason why the code is in the way it is. That's the point that he's making there. James Shapiro recently said this, only a few years ago, from the University of Chicago. It has been a surprise to learn how thoroughly cells protect themselves against precisely the kinds of accidental genetic change that, according to conventional theory, are the sources of evolutionary variability. By virtue of their proofreading and repair systems, living cells are not passive victims of the random forces of chemistry and physics. They devote large resources to suppressing random genetic variation and have the capacity to set the level of background localized mutability by adjusting the activity of their repair systems. So he's basically saying, if you have a mutation in this system, you've actually got so much acting against it. To say, as many people do, that mutations brought information doesn't really ring true to those who know a lot about the biochemistry of DNA and its accompanying systems. So what defines the information in DNA? It's basically like computer programming. It doesn't come about by accident. You might have thought sometimes that Windows 8 did. But I assure you, Bill Gates and a fleet of other people making lots of money did actually put it together. Information implies intelligence, even there. It did imply some intelligence. And intelligence implies mind. And you can't get away from it. Dr. Geher, mind came first. You write, humans are largely the cultural ape. You also write, our genes coded for us, created us, the reason we exist. You said that in a radio program, which I listened to. May I ask, who, in your framework, or what is us? And what is we? You see, Francis Crick said, if the code does indeed have some logical foundation, then it is legitimate to consider all the evidence, both good and bad, in any attempt to deduce it. Well, that was fair enough. But he then went on to say, in his astonishing hypothesis writing, sadly, Francis Crick has died now, but he said, you, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, your ambitions, your sense of personal identity, free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. What a sad position. He's basically saying you're just an automaton. You're just governed by lots of neurons, lots of chemistry. Is that all we are? Even Eugene Wigner, who wasn't particularly a person on my side of the argument, even he said, as a great mathematician who'd studied quantum mechanics, quantum physics, he said, I'll just take the central quote here, it is hard to believe that our reasoning power was brought by Darwin's process of natural selection to the perfection which it seems to possess. Quite so, I would agree. If the concept of truth, John Lennox says, results from nothing more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells, how in the name of logic would we know that our brain was composed of nerve cells? You think about that. He's saying a very profound point. How come that we're aware of the very fact that we can think rationally? And Charles Darwin expressed it brilliantly when he said, with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, in his opinion, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Quite so, I do agree with you, Charles. It's a very horrid doubt, and may that horrid doubt grow in your minds today. Polkinghorne, whom I don't agree on everything he says, and I don't say that I agree with any of all these quotes that I have here, but he quite rightly said this, if Crick's thesis is true, we could never know it. For not only does it relegate our experience of beauty, moral obligation, and religious encounter to the epiphenomenological scrap heap, it also destroys rationality. Thought is replaced by electrochemical neural events. Two such events cannot confront each other in rational discourse. They are neither right nor wrong. They simply happen. The very assertions of the reductionist himself are nothing but blips in the neural network of his brain. The world of rational discourse dissolves into the observed chatter of firing synapses. Haldane said, if my mental processes are determined solely by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true. And hence I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms. Where has rational thought gone? It's gone out of the window. There is patent self-contradiction running through all attempts, however sophisticated they may appear, to derive rationality from irrationality. Lewis again said, nature is quite powerless to produce rational thought. Not that she never modifies our thinking, but that the moment she does so, it ceases to be rational. Then he says at the end, a train of thought loses all rational credentials as soon as it can be shown to be wholly the result of non-rational causes. In other words, if I had a big enough computer and could predict what Dr. Geher is going to say next, then it wouldn't be rational. He would just be simply the product of chemistry in his brain. I don't believe that for a moment, Dr. Geher. You are a rational human being, and your mind transcends the chemistry of your brain. Atheism, and I'm not saying, by the way, that Dr. Geher necessarily is an atheist, but atheism, and many of you here are, because you've come representing your table here, starts with freedom, no God, no authority, no foundation for truth, says we're just molecules, says we haven't a soul, says that we're just genes, says that there's no individual. There can't be, because genes don't have individuality. Says that there can't therefore be free will, because molecules don't have free will. Therefore, there's no freedom. It's a well-known argument philosophically that if you take that reductionist position that we are just a set of neurons, there is no coherent basis for rationality. There can't be, because molecules don't think. The philosophy of naturalism undermines naturalism. Rationality has no meaning. You are chopping the branch on which you are sitting. The only basis for rationality is that there was a rational God who made us, and we are made in his image. It's the only basis for true science. That's why science grew out of the Christian worldview. Schrödinger said this: the scientific picture of the real world around me is very deficient. It gives a lot of factual information, puts all of our experience in a magnificently consistent order, but it is ghastly silent about all and sundry that is really near to our heart, that really matters to us. It cannot tell us a word about red and blue, bitter and sweet, physical pain and physical delight. It knows nothing of beautiful and ugly, good or bad, God and eternity. Science sometimes pretends to answer questions in these domains, but the answers are very often so silly that we are not inclined to take them seriously. That's Schrödinger, who's one of the most brilliant quantum mechanics theorists. And you probably know Schrödinger's equation, those of you who do mathematics. So it raises the issue of morality. Where does it come from? And that is reflected in our art. Insightful, compelling. Next person says exemplary. Cleaner comes in, upside down. You see, you can't make sense of art if you haven't got a basis for the wonderful poetry that Dr. Geher referred to. And I agreed with him, actually, about the love for poetry. I love it as well. But your values have no meaning in a meaningless world, which has no basis for rationality. Jerry Coyne, who loves to trumpet his atheism in my country as well as yours, says evolution says you're not created. Evolution is a naturalistic philosophy. You've got no value more than a squirrel or an armadillo. And morality is an evolved phenomenon. And that would be, I know, Dr. Geher's position, because he's written on it. He agrees with Jerry Coyne. I totally disagree. Dr. Geher says, quite rightly, and I agree with much of what he says here, I'm further from a personal standpoint not someone who encourages males to engage in promiscuous behavior, and not someone who supports men to fly into violent, jealous rages with females as targets of their anger and aggression. Additionally, I'm strongly opposed to war, murder, rape, filicide. I would feel a moral obligation to reject outright any doctrine which is inconsistent with these fundamental aspects of my belief system. He's got a belief system. I respect that, thank you, and I really do. I'm not saying that all people of an evolutionary position don't have morals. That's not my position. Now I'm pushing what is the basis of them. I would see such a doctrine as downright evil. Well, now I ask you again, good man that you are, you like good things, but what is the basis of evil and good? Will Provine, whom I debated 2 or 3 years ago, said no life after death, no foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning for life, no free will. He also said no inherent moral or ethical laws exist, nor are there absolute guiding principles for human society. The universe cares nothing for us, and so on. Jacques Monod has said the same thing. I'll just take the highlighted quote. If it is true that there is no purpose in the universe, that man is a pure accident, you cannot derive any ought from is. The sense that there are laws. You can't derive absolute laws. We are lost in a quagmire, they are saying. And this brilliant quote that he says, a world that is deaf to his music, this is man's music, and is indifferent to his hopes as to his suffering, as it is to his suffering and his crimes. Monod was correct. This is the logical end game of evolution. Dawkins says it brilliantly. He says the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And he said to one of my friends in Oxford, my brain is just a lump of meat. How sad. Not only is there no basis for rationality, there is no rational foundation for right and wrong. Some of you have read Terry Pratchett. He writes some very brilliant books. I think you probably know them. He talks in this is fictional, but he talks about, and he's obviously talking about himself as though he were. I was walking along the bank of a stream when I saw a mother otter with the cubs. A very endearing sight, I'm sure you'll agree. And even as I watched, the mother dived into the water, came up with a plump salmon, which she subdued and dragged into a half-submerged log. As she ate it, while it was of course still alive, the body split, and I remember to this day the sweet pinkness of its roes as they spilled out, much to the delight of the baby otters, who scrambled over themselves to feed on the delicacy. One of nature's wonders, gentlemen. Mother and children dining upon mother and children. And that is when I first learned about evil. It is built into the very nature of the universe. Every world spins in pain if there is any kind of supreme being. I told myself it is up to us to become his moral superior. On what basis? On what basis? If you're atheist, you haven't got a moral basis. I tell you what's really going on with some atheists, and I'm not saying all are of this view, but Nagel was honest when he said, I want atheism to be true, and I am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. That's being honest. And Huxley said the same many years ago. I had motives for not wanting the world to have meaning, consequently assumed it had none, and was able without any difficulty to find satisfying reasons for this assumption. The liberation we desired was simultaneously liberation from a certain political and economic system and liberation from a certain system of morality. We objected to the morality because it interfered with our freedom. That's what's going on. I'm not saying all atheists are like this, but there are definitely some who are. Atheism is the natural handmaid and friend of evolution. Conclusion? Evolution takes no coherent understanding of the machinery that I showed you in life systems. It cannot explain rationality and truth, and it cannot explain what we all know is true in our human experience. We have morality and we have a conscience. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. McIntosh. I enjoyed that. I particularly like that you didn't give that in French, because I would not have understood it. And I very much appreciate the fact that you read my paper that I published in 2006. It does sound like there's some level of disagreement going on, and I guess as a social scientist, I will speak to that. I guess a main theme that I'm getting, and that I hope this is an accurate reflection, is that you take issue with the idea of human psychology, psychological processes, and behavior as being determined. So I guess we can think of the issue of determinism.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
So the way that I would define determinism or think about determinism is essentially the idea that phenomena that exist in the universe, that phenomena that exist in all domains, have factors that are causal, that phenomena don't exist with no causal underlying mechanisms. To say that the human mind is completely based on free will and is not part of the natural determined universe, I guess I'll go ahead and say that I find that somewhat problematic. The entire social sciences, all of the scientific disciplines that study aspects of human behavior, anthropology, cultural anthropology, understanding what are the basic features of cultural rules that exist across cultures. What are the things that people tend to do? Why do people tend to do these? Understanding sociology, political science, in my own field in particular, psychology. If there are no determining factors and understanding that relate to why people think what they do, then these scientific areas really don't have much of a purpose. So just to take social psychology, which is my particular sub-area, into account, if we can say that a behavioral feature, one of the things that's been studied, for instance, is conformity. So people tend to conform under certain conditions. Similar related, people tend to obey authority at high levels under certain conditions. This research, or research on these particular topics, has been famous in psychology for demonstrating the nature of human malleability. Behavioral malleability is a function of factors that affect behavior. If you manipulate situations, if you manipulate a situation, you can get people to conform at relatively high levels. What Stanley Milgram showed us years ago was that if you manipulate a situation in a certain way, you can get regular people to engage in behaviors that they would never see themselves as doing. So Stanley Milgram, famous set of studies in the 1960s, said he was very interested in things like the Holocaust and genocide, and under what conditions can you get people on such a large scale to exert such abhorrent costs on other people? And Milgram's answer to that, as a social scientist, was not that, well, these people just have free will, that these people were bad people, that there's a distinction between good people versus bad people, that there's just free will and that's just what those people were thinking at the time. Rather, as a scientist who's a determinist, he said, what are the factors that lead to that? What are the factors that can make a human being engage in such abhorrent behavior to another human being? So he set up a laboratory at Yale University, and then later in Bridgeport, Connecticut, nearby, in something that was unaffiliated, ostensibly, with the university. And he put people in a situation, regular people, and they were in a situation where they were asked to be in a learning experiment, and they were told, this was the cover story, they were told, you're in a study where people are going to learn, and you're either the teacher or the learner. And if you're the teacher, we're interested in the effects of electric shock. Now, this wasn't true, this was just a cover story. And so I just told people, you're going to need to shock this person. This person's in the other room and is connected to an electric plate, and you have potential to shock that person. And the shocks are to increase each time the person messes up the learning. And so you give that person a 15-volt shock, and then 30-volt, and then it went all the way up to 450. Now, the shock machine that people were sitting in front of had words labeled. At about 300, it said danger, and at about 400, it said XXX. The person in the other room, who was really a confederate of the experimenter, sat there, and it was always the same person, and it was a middle-aged guy who said from the outset, this was part of his script, he said, I have a heart condition, I was in the war, are the shock's going to hurt me? And the experimenter, by design, says no in each case. They're painful, but they're not going to be harmful to you. So the naive participants, so a bunch of regular individuals, naive participants, regular people from the streets of Connecticut, from the pavements of Connecticut, come into the laboratory, and they sit there, and there's a tall guy with a lab coat on who says, I'm the experimenter, you're going to have to follow what I do, and the experiment must go on. So the experimenter says, go ahead, and the experiment starts. And the person tries to teach the other person words, and by design, the person in the other room messes up. He messes up on a bunch of conditions. And the subjects, the naive subjects, regular people, start shock the person in the other room. They think they're really giving genuine shocks. And there's a point at which the guy in the other room screams, as if he's in pain. And consistently, the subjects look at the experimenter and they say, should we continue? And the experimenter always said, we must continue. So the people continue. 2/3 of the people in this condition shocked to a point where the person stopped screaming. So he starts screaming extensively, and then he stops screaming. And after he stops screaming, if you watch the video, you think that person's probably dead in the other room. And that's probably what the naive subject thinks. And the experimenter says, you must continue. 2/3 of the people continued shocking all the way up to that 450 mark. And these were regular people. These weren't evil people. These weren't people that were chosen from a pool of evilness. What Stanley Milgram showed was normal people pulled off the streets of Connecticut, what we consider a normal place, are capable of extraordinarily horrific behaviors. And then he manipulated the study. He said, well, what happens if that person has to put the subject's hand on an electric plate? And wouldn't you know, when that happened, people suddenly said, oh, that's really icky. And a very small percentage of people obeyed the authority to such a degree. There was another condition under which they said, okay, well, what happens if you can't hear the guy screaming in the other room? You have no idea what's happening to the guy in the other room. All you know is that you hit 450, and it says danger and XXX on this thing. And under that condition, nearly 100% of the participants in that particular study shocked all the way. In reality, giving someone that kind of shocks over 300 volts would have really killed these particular people. What Stanley Milgram documented, and this is an extraordinarily important insight on the nature of human mind and human behavior, is that when we see things that we consider immoral behavior, this is not particularly a consequence of individuals. This is an important consequence of situations that have effects on individuals' behavior. To say that behavior is only determined by free will is, I'd argue to say that Milgram's research was not necessary, and that there are no factors that affect behavior. But on the contrary, Milgram showed, and I know some of my stat students are here, and he had some great statistics to back this up, by the way. He showed, with very strong statistical evidence, that the nature of the situation had a profound effect on the behavior of the individuals across situations. This is just probably one of the most interesting examples, but the entirety of the social sciences is an exercise in understanding the factors that cause human behavior. So I guess from my perspective, determinism in understanding human behavior is very useful, it's very practical, it helps us solve important social problems, and I think that would be just a useful perspective for us to consider. Thank you.
Dr. Geher, you've just mentioned a well-known experiment, and I'm aware of it. It's a tragic demonstration of human nature. And so was the real experiment that Hitler did when he manipulated a whole nation to do terrible things. I don't think that proves the fundamental point that behavior is determined only by, analysis of chemistry or analysis of behavior in some social science way. You are quite right that there are factors, but I'm saying that fundamentally there is something which is to do with us being made in the nature of God. And I want to just draw to your attention, or I'll just make one other comment on one of the things you said in the first talk, that you said, quite rightly, that the morality of parents who are step-parents and who very sadly kill their own stepchildren, that it's more likely to happen in that scenario than it is when it's their own children. You called it the Cinderella effect. Nobody's denying that there are things like that, and it's well documented, and I appreciate the research which you brought out. But that is also consistent with the Christian morality, which is what I want to now comment on. You see, Chesterton said, take the first more obvious case of materialism. As a sort of explanation of the world, it has a sort of insane simplicity. It has just the quality of a madman's argument. If we take reductionism to its extreme, and I'm not saying Dr. Geher is necessarily doing this, if we have at once the sense of it covering everything and the sense of it leaving everything out. Contemplate some able and sincere materialist. He understands everything, and everything doesn't seem worth understanding. If you reduce it just to chemistry and neurons, then you basically haven't grasped the whole picture. That's what Chesterton is saying. So I just remind you as to some of the things I've said. Reductionism fails to grasp that machines are essential to transmit information. True information won't just be built by random energy coming into a pea soup of chemicals. Also, I said that reductionism, which is basically what I was aiming at, fails to realize that information is transcendent to matter and energy. Remember I said that? Information uses symbols and patterns. So we know from our own study of information systems in the laboratory, in the computer information systems, we all know that actually information isn't just defined by matter and energy. We've got to go deeper than where the science is going at the moment. If I showed you that picture, you'd say it's just splodges. If I went further back, you'd say the splodges have got a bit of green in. But if I showed you the complete picture, some of you would immediately recognize Monet's beautiful picture of the poppy field. You see, reductionism misses the big picture. He understands everything, Chesterton says, and yet it's not worth understanding. The big danger of a reductionist philosophy is he misses the real picture. In other words, we're missing God out of the picture. We all know that origins have implications. Who am I? Where did I come from? How did I get here? And what does life really mean? You remember I've said that the atheist endgame, which many people take evolution to, doesn't understand the science of design, doesn't have really a coherent answer to rationality, doesn't have a coherent answer to morals. May I unashamedly say I'm a Christian. It doesn't understand the person of Christ, doesn't understand his life, will never understand it, will deny his resurrection. And, what's more, evolutionary psychology in particular, but many evolutionists who are atheists, will deny real conversion. Some years ago, I went upstairs in my home and I realized something was wrong because my wife had just started coming downstairs calling my name. I went into the room upstairs and my own son had died. If you believe in a reductionist philosophy, you cannot deal, in my view, with the reality of what life is at the end. I am not saying that many evolutionists whom I know have deep feelings. Of course they do. But they don't have a rational framework in which to understand their subjective experiences. I am appealing now subjectively. I've taught theoretically. But my philosophy, I will testify, works in practice. If I had adopted Dawkins' philosophy, that child which had just died was just a lump of meat. Could he say that to his own daughter if she had died? I very much doubt it. Darwin had some problems with the design argument. He couldn't understand how a benevolent designer could have cats playing with mice before killing them. He couldn't understand nature read in tooth and claw. David Attenborough in my country, who's a well-known broadcaster on evolution, has said very similar things. But may I say, these evolutionists have not grasped what the creation model says. The creation model says that there was a perfect world, but we rebelled, and that's most important to grasp. I've mentioned the death of my own son. Evolution simply says death has to be, it's a stepping stone to progress. The Bible says that death, as I've already intimated, is a result of rebellion. Now, I know that there may be extenuating circumstances why some people will do what was described in the experiment that Dr. Geher referred to. I know full well that probably I wouldn't have survived in Nazi Germany, that I would have driven a truck if I'd been pushed between my own family and the Jews to be buried who'd just been shot at. You know that happened. People had to make choices. But I'm still saying that ultimately all evil like that just referred to tracks back to one person's rebellion. And the Bible says that by nature we have rebelled and that there is only one answer. The Lord Jesus Christ, the Bible says, who is the Creator, has changed some people who are prepared to acknowledge that he has redeemed them. I testify to the fact that conversion is a real experience. It's not just psychology. I can invite Dr. Geher to examine all the Christians who've attended here and ask them for their personal testimonies. And they will each one of them say that they met with a God who is transcendent, who made them in his image and who has saved them. And that there is a power at work in this world which no amount of analyzing of neurons or behavioral psychology can explain. May God help us to understand the true nature of mind and intelligence and the true nature of the Creator who has made us. Thank you.
I guess the main thing that you got me to think about in that last segment, I guess this is often the case with some kind of disagreement, is there's probably more agreement than necessarily seems to be the case. You're talking about reductionism, and so I think, at least this would be my interpretation, that reductionism is the idea that everything sort of boils down to something very basic. And then you referred to what I had talked about in terms of Milgram's study as extenuating circumstances. What do you think of the idea of determinism as including not just physiological or physical causes, but causes that are social and beyond just the physical?
I do accept a measure of what you're saying. Clearly, there are things which affect people, and you demonstrated that, and by doing it with animals, you'll probably get similar effects. Man has an animal instinct, if we can say that. I'm not saying he is an animal, but he has some instincts which are similar. So some of those can be demonstrated in a controlled experiment. But man is not just, in that sense, like an animal. I don't like using that word because it would suggest that my foundation is that he's come from an animal, and I don't believe that at all. But there are some aspects which are similar. Man is more than that. He's a rational human being, and he makes choices which are to do with his own conscience as well as to do with his own desires, like you showed. So man is more, much more. And so what I would say is that some of what you've said is clearly is a factor in people's choices, because sometimes they'll make just the choice for this particular desire to fulfill this particular thing that they want, whether it be in the moral area of relationships in marriage, or whether it be to do with the area in family, where you mentioned filicide and all these terrible things that have been done. But we need a higher authority to appeal to people to change. And that's what I would suggest your system of thought doesn't allow, because all your idea of law is relative. I'm appealing to an absolute. You're saying that there isn't one, as far as I understand.
Okay.
Sorry, it was a long answer.
Okay.
I'll try and be brief to your next question.
Sure. So let me just get this straight. So I guess I'm going to ask the hard question. I guess that's what I'm supposed to do.
You should.
All right, I got a hard question. Do you believe in evolution?
I don't accept it in the way that I defined it earlier. The molecules to man, protons to prime ministers, presidents, that pea soup idea, I don't accept. I accept variation. There's variation in dogs, there's variations in the humankind. But we haven't come from the same creatures as apes. We're not related. We're not cousins.
Okay. And I guess as a quick follow-up, what do you say to people who present evidence to the contrary?
They
such as, I guess I'm going to interject myself, sorry.
Please do.
Such as fossil evidence and comparative anatomy and so forth.
People will present similar pendactyl structures, for instance, in the hand and the arms of other creatures like reptiles. But similarities in morphology don't prove that one creature has come from another. They just simply could also be argued as being just similarity in the framework of design. So there is no argument, in my view, from morphology for a clear argument for evolution. People who argue from the fossils are actually often missing clear evidence that there are creatures which they say have been evolved into coming earlier than the creatures they're saying are the ones which are ancestors. For instance, in this famous book by Marvin Lubenow, where he talks about bones, plural, of contention, he takes case after case of supposed ancestors to human beings. And even though he, and also me, doesn't accept the dates of the strata, he takes that as his framework, right? He takes the geological column as though he accepted it. And then he shows case after case where actually all you've got is either a human kind or an ape kind, and you've never got a halfway creature. Sometimes you've got cases where the so-called human ancestor is actually coming earlier than the creature he's meant to have come from. And so he shows that in the reasoning of the evolutionist from the fossil record, there is a lot of hand-waving going on.
Okay, I don't know that I necessarily agree with that. Can I ask?
Of course you won't. No,
more
I'm not expecting you to.
Okay.
I'm not expecting you to agree. It's the basis of your philosophy. You wouldn't agree with it.
So let me ask you this. I've spent, one of the primary things I've done in my career, and I tried to explicate it in my presentation, was to expand evolution's role in education. Based on the idea that evolution has extraordinary potential to help us understand pretty much everything. And one of the main things that I tried to underscore in my presentation is that evolution not only can help us understand phenomena across all areas of academia, but it also has exquisite capacity to help us understand important social issues and social problems and issues of humanity. So I guess with that said, and that's something of a setup, what are your thoughts about the future of evolution and evolutionary studies within education?
clearly, the majority view in the Western world is that evolution is the mother of all things. As you said, we understand everything through the lens of evolution. You didn't use quite that term, but that's what you were saying. We understand everything, you said. Well, in education, you should always encourage critical thinking. When Christianity was much more dominant in education, people rightly said, we shouldn't just believe everything simply because it's said. We should test everything. What has happened in education today is that evolution has become the overarching worldview. And my desire in education is not to say that evolution shouldn't be taught, because clearly I must accept that many colleagues think differently to me. But what I do ask is that in education there should be a critical appraisal of evolution itself. That is, people should be allowed to say, but what about this? What about alternatives? What about alternative ways of looking at the evidence? Not necessarily full-blown creation thinking, but clearly they must be allowed to say what they think. And also in the education in the tertiary system in America has stopped all possibility of intelligent design. Not that I particularly take that position, but obviously I accept many tenets of the intelligent design people. And certainly to stop any critical thinking coming from a creation perspective. And the Supreme Court has actually legislated to stop critical appraisal. I think that's wrong.
All right. So now we will turn it over to Dr. McIntosh to pose questions to Dr. Geher.
Yes, you said, Dr. Geher, that you felt that evolution was a watershed framework. That was one of the first sentences you used in your talk. What watershed were you crossing?
Interesting question. I'll tell you that within so many areas of academia, the evolutionary perspective just sheds extraordinary new light, and I think that's what I meant by that. In the 1960s, Paul Ekman did some of the most renowned research in the field of sort of early evolutionary social psychology, and what he found, and it's kind of simple, but it's very useful in understanding a basic thing about us. He followed up on what Darwin had to say about emotion, and why do people feel, and why do we behave sometimes based on our emotions and not based on things that we know are better or cognitions that we have. And what Ekman said was, well, let's take a look at the nature of emotion from an evolutionary perspective. And this was very, very novel in the 1960s at the time. He had people just make very basic emotional expressions, having people smile, having people make an angry face, having people make a sad face. And he had other people, just normal adults, look at these pictures and just say, well, can you tell which one's happy, which one's angry, which one's sad? Seems pretty simple. And people were almost 100% accurate at this. People can also do the same thing, and Darwin himself made this point in the emotional expression of man and animals. If we look at a cat, if you've ever given a cat a bath, you see an angry animal, and people can universally say, that's anger. I know exactly what that is. And then what Paul Ekman did, based on this reasoning, was he had people from cultures far and wide, and he had them look at pictures of American college students making different emotional expressive kinds of faces. And their ability, even though they didn't share language, they didn't share the same culture, their ability to accurately detect the emotions was just as good as the United States citizens making judgments about other American college students. And this particular point, the universal nature of emotional expression, demonstrated that there is something extraordinarily important about the evolutionary underpinnings of who we are to helping us understand something as basic as emotion. Paul Ekman from then became one of the single most important social scientists there is, and his research has just led to lots and lots of insights, and that's just a single example. So do we understand emotion, which is a basic part of who we are, much better because of the evolutionary perspective? I'd say absolutely. I think we understand pretty much every aspect of human behavior much better because of the evolutionary perspective, and that's what I mean by a watershed event.
But now let me press you a bit more on where this leads to in terms of mind and intelligence, which after all is the major title that we had. Darwin talked about his horrid thought that our minds should have arisen from the lower animals, and yet how could rationality, as I tried to clearly show you, how can rationality come from chemistry and just mutations in genetic expressions and alleles? Are we really saying that the ability to think in mathematics on quantum mechanics or in social sciences, more in your area, is that just coming from chemistry changes in irrational or essentially creatures which are certainly not as rational as us? Are you really saying that rationality arose out of the mud?
Well, the nature of the human mind is ultimately a product of evolutionary forces. But and I do believe that. But let me ask you.
What molecules think? That's what you're ending up saying.
Let me ask you this then. Do you think, I mean, putting it in terms of rationality and intelligence, do you think that a subset of human psychology has what you call shared with animal instincts? Do you think emotional reactions are somehow different qualitatively than...
I could see...
In terms of their origins, do you think the emotion system, for instance, and other things we might think of as sort of basic psychological processes in humans, are you saying that those came about by different kinds of processes than higher order cognitive kinds of systems like the ability to do math and the ability to have a high level of conversation?
I'm just observing the animal world, and they don't do cognitive higher mathematics. And we do. I say that shows that we're made in the image of a creator who knew about mathematics beforehand. Indeed, I don't know whether you've read Roger Penrose, who's no Christian, but he wrote the book The Emperor's New Mind. He's more of a Platonist. But actually the Greeks do have something to teach us here, that they taught that mind has to be different to matter. And in that sense, we do agree as Christians. Can I ask you a last question?
If Dr. Milam says so.
Because I've only had two, and he asked me one back, which I let him do.
Go right ahead.
The question, of course, is, our morality, is it absolute or relative? In other words, if somebody says that I'm going to murder this whole group with a suicide bomb,
Ouch.
On what basis can I say that that person is wrong? For instance, Boston, which happened earlier in the week, and by the way, I'm very sad if you've got people who've connected with that terrible event. But, on what basis can I say to whoever perpetrated that, you have committed absolute evil? On what basis?
I guess I'd say one of the keys to human evolution, one of the things that makes us special, and by the way, every species is by definition special. We just happen to have our own special qualities. Spiders have their own special qualities. Dolphins have their own special qualities, as do various kinds of slugs. So I do think that that's important, that we just happen to be a unique species, just like every species is in their own particular way, designed to match their ancestral kinds of conditions. The nature of human morality, I would argue, is very basic. That if you look at moral systems across cultures, while you see a lot of variability, you see extraordinary constancy in the issues that are addressed. The moral systems across groups tend to be things that say, sacrifice your own needs, benefit the group, act in pro-social kinds of ways. When we see an individual who is engaging in a way that is a cost to the group or at a cost to ourselves, there's a very strong tendency for people to punish those kinds of behaviors. Behaviors that bring down others are considered morally abhorrent, and the kinds of behaviors that, if you look at moral codes across groups, you tend to see things like don't kill other people, don't injure other people, don't steal from other people. be kind and respectful to authority figures. These are things that they're extraordinarily universal across various, like extraordinarily varied groups of individuals. These are things that I think are basic, and a core feature of humans from an evolutionary perspective is our tendency to create what are called non-kin in-groups, that we have an expansion of groups, that if you look at other kinds of primates, they have relatively small groups. If you look at humans, we have groups that are in the millions and millions, and even in the billions. And it is that psychological tendency to have a shared moral system among individuals ends up being something that's essentially a kind of very important glue. I'm not saying it's bad, I'm saying that it's absolutely an essential part of humanity and of human evolution. But moral systems are very consistent across cultures, and I think they're a very important part of human evolutionary heritage. And I don't envision the significant moral systems that comprise humans being something that will be selected out. So I'd say that you're right about the importance of morality. I fully agree with you, and I think that's an important part of our evolutionary heritage.
How does that help us to have critical thoughts, though? Like those things, like, I understand what you're trying to say, but that doesn't give us the product of critical thinking.
No, I actually disagree with that strongly, if that's okay. I will say that the Evolutionary Studies program that we have on this campus, which is part of the International Evolutionary Studies Consortium, started at Binghamton, has been wildly successful in promoting critical thinking. And in fact, research on the students of the Evolutionary Studies program at Binghamton that has shown that students in that program, compared to other students, matched for GPA, matched for entrance SAT, students who joined the Evolutionary Studies program compared with students who didn't, years later ended up doing significantly better in their academic work, not just in evolutionary studies courses, but in courses across the spectrum. And the basic idea there is that the application of evolutionary principles that we find in the evolutionary studies program is so powerful. It's so integrative. It teaches a basic set of ideas, and it connects academic areas not from content, not saying there's this content and we can study it from this perspective or that perspective, but it has a basic set of ideas that once it's taught to students, these students can apply it and can just so deeply understand and make connections across so many areas. So in the Evolutionary Studies seminar series this semester, we had someone talk about evolution and human health recently. We had someone talking about the evolution of yawning recently. We had someone talk about metabolic constraints on pregnancy and ancestral humans and how that ended up leading to altricial babies. And the students in that program, and I believe there's probably some of them in the room now, just get the most kind of integrative. The students see those talks and they hear those talks, and immediately these students, because they understand basics of evolution and evolutionary principles and evolutionary forces, they get it. They totally see how the nature of human health and metabolic constraints on metabolism in pregnancy and the nature of yawning across all vertebrates, by the way, are connected. And I think that that's evidence of very powerful critical thinking.
Yes, Dr. McIntosh, you voiced that you had an issue with all human consciousness coming down to chemical and physical processes. I think there are many things contrary to that, such as drugs, which may affect my perception of the world and how I take things in. If I were to be given a lot of testosterone, that would drastically change my worldview and affect that. And there's a lot of cases where tumors affect behavior and change personalities. So I guess is how do you fit that into the worldview that physical is not the source of consciousness?
Thank you for the question. Clearly, I'm not saying that there aren't effects of drugs. It's well known that drugs can have a huge effect on behavior. And of course, if I take some particular drugs, like the ones you mentioned, fellas in particular can become very aggressive, and it can do a huge amount of damage. So of course I'm not saying that there aren't effects of chemistry, and also when people suffer illnesses like dementia, they can become aggressive, where their complete personality changes as a result of the chemistry. But clearly that is not the norm. The norm is that we are rational human beings who have to recognize that there is a mind which has brought everything into existence, because our own scientific endeavor shows to us that a mind has to come first, which was the basic point that I was making in the lecture, or my part of the lecture, that mind has to come first in human experience. A mind then organizes and sorts things out. Now, if there are troubles within this, just thinking in scientific terms, apart from the spiritual, which of course I accept, which not everybody here is going to accept, but if you're just thinking of mind and intelligence, right, clearly if you have an organized system, which you have made, right, then if you actually have some technical fault going wrong, which is a bit like the chemistry and what you've been saying, that will mess up the system, and that becomes abnormal. But to say then that the chemistry is actually determining what the system is for, whether it be a car, an aeroplane, whatever, that would be nonsense. The aeroplane, the car, or whatever the systems engineering that one's using is made by a mind, and we are made by a mind. Our normal way of operating is that chemistry is subservient to something else, and it's our mind. And I believe actually it's subservient to an even greater mind. May I just say that on the earlier comment that was made, that when it comes to the evolutionary critical appraisal, you've got to allow an intelligent design position to be represented. You cannot have critical appraisal just within the evolutionary framework. You've got to allow, taking up your point, those who think that there is a mind which comes first to critically appraise the very things that Dr. Geher was trying to argue that he has critically appraised. He doesn't have a critical appraisal. I don't know, I haven't seen on his list of lectures anybody to be invited from a Christian perspective who has a Christian view of mind and intelligence. He hasn't invited anybody of the caliber of Professor John Lennox or anybody else. You've got to have critical appraisal of evolution. I may be wrong in some areas, but let's have the debate.
Do you have a question for Dr. Geher?
Sure. Dr. William Provine, evolutionary biologist, said that, quote, man must give up hope, that evolutionary biology teaches that man must give up hope that he has free will. Isn't that a self-contradictory statement? Isn't the act of giving up hope an act of free will? So my question is, does man have free will? And isn't the fact that we are sitting here hoping to get the right answer on this whole thing, debate, demonstrating we have free will?
I think that is a very eloquently stated question. I think my response pertains to the question that we heard over here a minute ago, and some of the things that I'd said earlier about factors that affect behavior. Cigarette smoking, alcohol abuse. These are things that if we really had free will, we wouldn't have to have multi-million-dollar campaigns against cigarette smoking. We wouldn't have to have multi-billion-dollar prison systems if free will were the primary determinant of human behavior. Because if free will were the primary determinant of human behavior, then people could say, I'm not going to do something illegal, I know the laws, and that would be that. But on the other hand, when you take a look at the money that we all put into the excessive prison system in the United States, I think we've got to ask ourselves, is this really the result of free will, or where does free will come into place? In psychology and the other social sciences, we use the phrase multifactorial causation. So I do agree with Dr. McIntosh on some of the problems associated with strict reductionism, the idea that there are just neurons and that's 100% underlying everything about human behavior. But there are also situational factors. What Stanley Milgram showed is you put someone in a situation like this and they'll behave this way, you put them in a different situation, they'll behave that way. If free will were the only cause of behavior, the situation would not matter. When we think about learning, when people are reinforced for certain behaviors, and they're more likely to show those behaviors because they are reinforced across time and they are punished for doing other behaviors across time, they are showing that there are factors, significant factors, beyond just straight reductionist physiological factors that have a very profound effect on human behavior. So I guess personally, I take a very pragmatic approach. And there's an awful lot of philosophy and an awful lot of logic, and there's an awful lot of important semantics in that kind of comment that you're talking about regarding free will. But from my perspective, I think academia should be about best understanding the nature of who we are, and largely so that we can better address the issues of society. And appealing to just the idea of free will almost puts our hands behind our back and says, well, then there's no reason to look for situational causes of behavior, or the nature of learning histories on behavior, the nature of drugs or tumors or chemicals on behavior, because the answer to why behavior exists is free will. So I guess as a social scientist, it's very useful for me to look beyond just free will.
Don't all addictions start with the first act of free will, though? The very first time you take a drug or take a smoke, that was an act of free will. After that, yes, chemical dependencies could arise. But the very first act of doing anything is an act of free will.
Dr. McIntosh, since you think that genetics were made by a mind, as you say, where do you think genetic diseases like Down syndrome come from? For example, if they are not for survival, they're not in the interest of whoever has these certain genetics. Because if it was made by a mind, there wouldn't be mistakes like this, right?
Thank you for the question. What I'm saying, if you remember, I ended my second session in my rebuttal on my conviction that the world was originally created perfect, right? And my conviction, which is that the trouble that has come into the world, including Down syndrome and other mutational diseases, genetic diseases, these have come as a result of the fact that suffering and death came because man rebelled. That's the Christian worldview. And the Bible, of course, teaches that. It doesn't mean that a person who has that is less.
Of course not, but it's
than
not
the other.
very helpful in survival. That's what I'm saying.
In terms of survival, clearly there are issues that it's more difficult for that person, and it relies on altruism of the population to make sure that those babies are looked after and indeed are not aborted, from my conviction. I don't think they should be, but that's my personal conviction. And I believe actually that this shows the other side to human beings, which is that we are not just a survival agent. We are actually, to come back, this reflects a bit on the last question, we are actually responsible agents. And we haven't mentioned responsibility. It's not just a matter of free will, as William Provine tries to argue. It's a matter of responsibility. We are responsible agents. And the family who is given a Down syndrome baby has to act responsibly. And the person who is tempted to go out and misuse cigarettes or misuse alcohol is not acting responsibly. Now, it may be that there are other factors in these matters, where they are not so responsible, but nevertheless, deep down, it's not just a matter of free will. We are responsible human beings, and it isn't just a matter of the survival of the human race. It's a matter of morality. We have a moral God, and we're made in the image of a moral God.
Question for Dr. Geher, or?
Dr. McIntosh.
All right. Do you have a question for Dr. Geher?
Yes, it's in response to your comment that fossil records support evolution. I'm interested in knowing your explanation for the Cambrian explosion, where it clearly shows that higher ordered organisms existed before simpler organisms, when Darwin himself said if there was one instance where you found this situation, the whole theory of evolution needs to be thrown out.
I think I'd want to defer to my friend Alice Bartholomew for that. When I took on this particular topic and agreed to this, the topic is within the realm of psychology. The Cambrian explosion, there are lots of I guess, significant questions within the field of evolution, and the Cambrian explosion is certainly one of them, but the best evidence that I've seen speaks to the fact that this is just a natural part of the evolutionary chain of events. Complexity across time goes in various kinds of directions, and I'd say this is
Even
what...
though Darwin himself said if in one instance, that if it occurred, you know, the person who kind of originated it all said that it needs to be thrown.
I'm not aware of that particular quote.
Okay.
Question for Dr. McIntosh.
Hi, thanks for coming. So first I'd like to just say I'm coming from the perspective, I'm religious, I'm Jewish, so I don't know how that changes your opinion. I'm also a second-year graduate student in Dr. Geher's lab. This is a very straightforward question.
Yeah.
I feel like I can offer, because I can understand both perspectives, I understand where you're coming from, and I agree and disagree with things you say. So my question is, you kept on talking about rationality and intelligence. So from my view, in order to be rational and intelligent, you need some sort of evidence, some sort of empirical evidence. So since I'm familiar with both religion and science, my belief in religion comes from my faith, whereas my belief in science comes from the evidence I've seen. And how Dr. Geher presented tonight, he presented at least 20 or 30 different authors where they presented empirical evidence, whereas you presented quotes, some that were great and that I agreed with, and some not so much. So my straightforward question is, I guess, where is your empirical evidence, either against religion, against evolution, or for religion, that would be able to supply a rational, intelligent mind?
My evidence is in my own discipline of thermodynamics, where I said in the first section of my talk that you cannot even get the molecules to polymerize without another machine coming in, right? If we say, and I take it that Dr. Geher subscribes to the whole idea that evolution came out of a pea soup of chemicals 4.5 billion years ago. I take it from the way he's said assertive statements when this has come up in discussion that is position. That is his position. If we try to argue that, I think we are going right against all the hard empirical sciences, of which my area of thermodynamics is part of it. All the physics, all the chemistry is telling me that you cannot get uphill thermodynamics to operate. That is, you cannot polymerize the proteins, you cannot polymerize the DNA, which codes for the proteins, you cannot get a stable situation to get ATP to form without having the whole system. It's called irreducible complexity. Now, that is Michael Behe's phrase, and you probably read Darwin's Black Box, but I recommend it if you haven't read it, from Lehigh University. He is correct. All the physics, all the chemistry tells you that you've got to have the whole system functioning to begin with to actually get the genetics on which evolution is going to try and work, supposedly, with mutations and then natural selection. The empirical evidence is that mutations do not produce advantage. We just had Down syndrome mentioned, but we could mention cystic fibrosis, we could mention color blindness, we could mention a whole host of genetic diseases which come from mutations. I also, although it was a quote, I was alluding to experimental evidence through James Shapiro, right? Who clearly said that in his area of genetics, there is resistance to change. That all the physics and the chemistry, the biochemistry, is saying evolution does not happen. You don't get, you may get alleles, so you get expressions of genetic, you get different genes coming out in the population. Right? Mendelian genetics, we accept that. We even accept that mutations can to a certain extent, be afforded within a particular population. For instance, the Galapagos, the diving birds, no, not the finches, the diving birds, it's gone from me. But there are some birds which have lost their ability to fly. The cormorants, the Galapagos cormorants, actually have lost their ability to fly, but they are surviving, right? But none of the genetics actually shows new function occurring in a population. The idea that reptiles produced wings is, to be frank, nonsense. I'm an aerodynamicist, and I was arguing against Dr. Walter Jan from Middletown, Sunny. And he was seriously saying that feathers could come from scales. Frankly, it's absurd. All the science is saying it doesn't happen. New function does not occur. So that's the empirical evidence underlining my creation/design position. Sorry to be strong, but obviously that is my conviction and my view. And it's based on good science as well as my Christian convictions.
Question for Dr. Geher.
Sure.
In the relationship between social sciences and the spiritual or the religious study, if evolution explains or helps us understand, you said that like the broad perspective that we might view similarities in spirituality across nations, in all cultures, etc., and they're common, so they would point more towards an evolution perspective. But my question is, there's a perspective in the Christian religion and in the Bible that says that man loves darkness rather than light. And I would like your opinion as a evolutionary perspective in the social sciences. Does evolution show that man loves light or darkness? And I bring that up because it interfaces in so many aspects of social science and behavior. And are we evolving to light or darkness? And what is not only what are we evolving to, but what do we like, or what do uneducated or uninfluenced? Where does man tend?
I think that's a great question. I'm not an expert on the Bible, and I'm not aware of the particular passages that you're talking about, but I am pretty familiar with the field of evolutionary religious studies, which has really tried to show what is so common. When we look at the variability of religious beliefs and doctrines across the world, this is particularly exemplified in David Sloan Wilson's Darwin's Cathedral, published in 2002, followed up by a lot of subsequent research. It's amazing how different religions are. So when you look at a religion, one rule is that you have to not work on Saturday, and another rule is, well, you're supposed to not work on Sunday, and you're supposed to eat this and you're supposed to eat that. But the commonalities, while they look so different on the surface, and there's a lot of research suggesting that seems to be something so that people can signal in groups. So if someone is wearing a particular religious symbol, that's a signal that person comes from your shared religion. And there's evidence suggesting that people are more altruistic toward individuals who are likely to come from their same religion. There's also evidence suggesting that people who see gory images that are connected with their particular religion don't see those gory images in a negative light. So there's something about the religion that sort of brings people to see others from their own group in a relatively positive way, and to see images of that religion in a very positive way. And that's a very basic part of who we are. Humans, like all organisms, end up having tendencies. I think the way that Dr. McIntosh put it is toward, I guess, animal instincts. And if you think about individuals that do things just for their own benefit, that is going to be something that within a social group is going to exert cost. So if there's a cheater in your group, if there's a cheater in your society, if there's a cheater in your class, if there's someone who always takes and never gives back, that is something that is going to be punished. And there's a lot of research on the psychology of reciprocal altruism, which shows that very universal is a tendency to detect accurately people who cheat on these social contracts. So it seems like one of the basic functions of moral systems, such as religious systems, seems to be to take humans and bring them into a culture where other-oriented behavior ends up being adaptive and where selfish-oriented behavior ends up being non-adaptive. And religion is, successful religions are outstanding at facilitating that and creating that set of behaviors. So I guess in terms of what you're talking about, in terms of the dark and the light, I think any organism is going to have a flexibility of behaviors, a variety of possible behaviors, and social rules that come from religion and other kinds of cultural norms end up being very much designed to encourage people to engage in other-oriented behavior rather than selfish kind of behavior. I mean, you can think about that as toward the light versus dark in terms of the metaphor you're talking about, and I think that's a very powerful metaphor.
Thank you.
If I may interject, the building, I've just been informed, is supposed to close at 11. So we'll just have one more question for Dr. McIntosh, and then those who are left who have questions perhaps could come forward and address your questions to the speakers personally. So do you have a question for Dr. McIntosh?
Yes. Sir, for the sake of argument, I'm willing to give you all of your pseudoscience, all of your pseudophysics, but assuming that, isn't all of your work still ahead of you in the sense, borrowing from Christopher Hitchens, that you still have to prove that, first of all, there is a God. Second of all, this particular God that you've decided to isolate is the God, and that it's not Thor, it's not Sol, it's not Zeus. Isn't that true, sir?
I will accept your question in the spirit in which you meant it, I think. To use pseudoscience is not really correct, is it? You have to be very careful using such words. I have studied for 30 years in my discipline. I have looked at it very carefully. And when I was answering the previous question, I was giving you very good, hard evidence to show that mind has to come before matter. That's my basic thesis tonight, right? Now you're asking a question, who is this God? That's a fair question. And as I say, I take the spirit of the question as to what I felt that you meant by it. I do object to the use of the word pseudo. I think that's not correct, because you may disagree with the implications I've drawn from the science, but I don't think you can disagree with the thermodynamics and the information. I was drawing on not just my discipline, I was drawing on the disciplines of mathematics, which have a huge bearing on this subject. Mathematics is the study of logic, and information systems is another area which is so relevant to this. Social science is very important, but social science sits, if we're going to do true evolutionary psychology, obviously I don't accept the evolution, but if one's going to suggest it's all due to evolutionary processes, it's sitting on top of a whole lot of other disciplines which are interwoven with this. And that's what I'm contending, that when you actually draw in the hard sciences which are underneath, they don't support the evolutionary conclusions. Now to the rub of your question. I maintain that the evidence points strongly to a designer, right? I'm not surprised, because the book that I deeply respect, the Bible, says in Romans 1 verse 20, the invisible things of God are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. Then it goes on to say, and I know I'm appealing to a book, but just hear me out, even his eternal power and Godhead. When I look at the science, it actually tells me that the God who exists must be rational, not just some sort of mistake, some deity who's just capriciously doing things, right? It tells me also that God is transcendent. That's what I've been at pains to emphasize, that the evidence of the science tells me that rationality cannot come from matter and energy, that the mind has to be there first. So the God who exists must be rational and transcendent, and that limits it greatly now. We're not talking about a God which I've made. Dawkins stupidly asks, who made God? As though somehow that has sorted out the question. No, it's not. All philosophers know that you either say that matter is eternal, or else you say that God is eternal. Now, having established that it's a rational God and he's transcendent, everything's pointing to the fact that the one person in this world who has said, I am truth, may well be the very God that we should worship. None other than the Lord Jesus Christ. I would suggest that you should think of him very seriously and read the accounts of his life, death, resurrection. Thank you.